Hello. So today we are going to talk a little bit about the history of omega-3s and kind of what led us to where we are today as far as why most people have a deficiency in omega-3s if they don't supplement and how that came about. So I'm just going to try and do this quick. It's a subject we could talk about for a very long time, but I'm going to just give you some facts, hit some bullet points, and then call it a day. A lot of this started with there was a certain point where researchers decided that what was causing heart disease in America was the consumption of animal fats, or I should say the consumption of dietary fats. So they, without really any good evidence or anything, that was the dominant hypothesis, and it was presented as a fact without being proven. So that was part of it. So that was one thing that started. The other thing that happened was it turns out that a lot of the fats that are really good for us don't have good shelf lives. So they're not very stable. They oxidize easily. They don't last as long. So manufacturers naturally wanted to make products that would last longer on a shelf if they didn't sell right away, or even if it was just, in your house on the shelf, so it lasted longer. So those were kind of two separate things that had a big impact on Americans' overall consumption of fats. Okay, probably started in the 50s or so. I'm going to go over some dates here in a minute, but 50s or the 60s, the theory came out about dietary fats. So that correlated with a lot of manufacturers just trying to make more shelf-stable products. So some of you have probably consumed margarine, I'm sorry, or you're at least aware of margarine. And that was really like the whole thing behind that was just it was a vegetable oil-based product, and it fit those two categories. So it was vegetable-based, it wasn't animal-based, and it has a longer shelf life than other fats do. So the problem, well, let me back that up. One of the problems with products like that is they contain hydrogenated oils, which if you don't know what that means, it basically means they add a hydrogen atom to it. This creates what is now known as a trans fat, and although there's a little bit of debate about it because they have found very minuscule amounts of trans fats in nature, for the most part, it's considered that they're very bad for us. The body doesn't really know what to do with them, even though it accepts them as a fat, causes problems. So most people recommend not getting any trans fats in your diet at all. Now, personally, I am a big fan of history. I love old books. And I have often said that I think one of the reasons a lot of people find history boring is because a lot of people who teach history make history about dates and not about people. And that just kind of kills the subject. However, sometimes looking at dates is beneficial. So I'm going to just go through some bullet points. I cherry-picked some important dates out of the history of this subject from a book called The Queen of Fats by Susan Allport. So I will put a link to that in the description, as long as I remember to do that when I'm doing the finishing touches on this video. If I forget, then at least you know Queen of Fats by Susan Allport. Look it up. It's a good book if you want to dig into the subject. This is a book that's really more just about the history of the science of the subject. It isn't getting into like so much as like how much fat you should eat or anything like that. It's not a nutrition book, but it's a really good book for people who are curious. So some of the things that happened that are significant are, and there's a lot. Again, I cherry-picked some stuff. In 1950, a researcher named Ralph Holman discovers that linoleic acid is a precursor to arachidonic acid, which is an omega-6, and that alpha-linoleic acid is a precursor to DHA and EPA, which are the omega-3s. So, and we've talked about this a little bit in the previous video, but humans need both. Okay, so both omega-6s and omega-3s are essential for human health. If you don't have them, you will be at the very least very unhealthy and possibly die. Although that can take a pretty extreme amount, but and that was one of the problems. But in 1962, deaths actually caused by what's called total parental nutrition, which is that's where you are in the hospital and for some reason you can't eat, so they hook you up. They hook you up to an IV to give you nutrients. And at that time, it was not understood that omega-6s were essential for human health. So the formula they were using didn't have any of that in it. They didn't think people needed it, and people actually died. It's very tragic, some of the stories, but and they didn't know why people were dying or what the problem was. But those deaths led to that discovery that omega-6 is essential. Now, that's just something you should know and understand. Most people living in modern society don't need to supplement with an omega-6. You can always check that out with blood work. That's the best way to know for sure. But if you eat out at all, or even if you cook at home, you're most likely getting all the omega-6s you need. And people store omega-6s better than omega-3s, so just keep that in mind. In 1967, trout raised with corn oil as the only fat in their diet suffered high mortality. So this is interesting because one of the big sources we get of healthy omega-3s these days is from fish. Either eating fish or supplementing with fish oil that's harvested from cold water fish. And sometimes that's from larger fish. A lot of times now it's from what's considered sort of more sustainable sources like sardines and things. But the reason that is a good source of fish oil, or of omega-3s I should say, is because the fish are swimming around in the ocean, eating other fish, eating other things that they eat in their normal diet, and their fat profile hasn't changed. When you have farm-raised fish, so if you go to a restaurant and you get salmon, there's a good probability that that salmon is farm-raised. That means it's like, if I can find a picture, I'll post one in the description, but it's basically in an enclosed area. It's not eating a normal diet, and the quality of the protein is still good protein. What you're not getting is the healthy fats. Okay, so, and the bottom line there is just it's not everybody can eat salmon. It's just not sustainable. So, in 1972, now this is a big one. In 1972. Two researchers from Denmark. They're European. I'm not sure exactly where they're from. I should know. I've read about them a lot. Bang and Dyerberg. They went to Greenland, and they wanted to visit the Eskimos because they had heard reports. And you got to keep in mind, this is 1972, so this is like, there was no internet. Much different world as far as information, as far as access to information. Okay, back then there were these things called encyclopedias that people would invest in. They were like books that you could look at. You couldn't just get online and look stuff up real quick and find pictures and things. So anyway, these two researchers went to Greenland to meet with some Eskimos, and they introduced themselves to one or two different tribes. They spent some time with them, and they got members of the tribe to agree to let them draw blood so they could study it, because they had heard reports that the Eskimos were eating diets that were extremely high in dietary fat, but that they did not really have any problems with heart disease, so they wanted to look into that. And they found a lot of interesting stuff. One of the things that came out of that was a real good example of how science should take place is, and I should have looked her name up, but they had an assistant with them who was drawing the blood, and she noticed that it took about twice as long for the Eskimos' blood to clot as what would be expected from someone following a Western diet. So I think the average time for a typical American or European is about 4 minutes, and I think it was taking the Eskimos about 8 minutes to clot. Now, I say that's how science should take place, because what's happening is someone's just doing something that's part of their study, and they find something they didn't expect and they look into it. Part of what's interesting about that is a lot of people's reaction will be that, well, like the way our blood clots is normal, but we don't actually know what the normal is because it's affected by the viscosity of the blood, which is affected by the omega-3 content of the blood. So, and you know, omega-3s, as I've talked about before, have a big impact on, you know, the prevention of blood platelets like clotting when we don't want them to in the bloodstream. So 8 minutes, 4 minutes, we don't really know what's like normal, if that makes sense. Let's see here. One of the things that Bang and Dyerberg discovered on, they went more than once, they went 2 or 3 times at least, but they found that the Eskimos actually had lower levels of serum cholesterol and triglycerides than people following like a typical normal Western diet. Again, this was 1972, so. In 1973, a researcher named Lanz discovered that prostaglandins, which are, maybe should have talked about that earlier, but they're cell messengers, made from omega-3s are less inflammatory than those made from omega-6s. So one thing I didn't really touch on in the last video, maybe I'll talk about in the next one, again I'm trying to keep this brief, is omega-3s have a anti-inflammatory effect, omega-6s have a pro-inflammatory effect. So if someone has too many omega-6s, which is most people, they're more likely to have high inflammation. When someone gets that under control, they're more likely to, well, it depends on what's going on, but like that in itself can cause inflammation to go up. So that's one reason you want to get an adequate omega-3s to keep inflammation down. This is a big one. 1977, the World Health Organization concludes that infant formulas should match the milk from well-nourished mothers. So there's a lot that actually goes into that, but omega-3s and omega-6s are actually really important for infants and babies as far as, like heart health and their development of their brains and things. So omega-6s and omega-3s are very important for infants. They're important for all of us, but as far as like a developing child, not just a fetus, but a developing child, they're extremely important. And food manufacturers, so this was like affirmed in 1977, okay? And I'm not claiming the World Health Organization is fantastic by any means, but at least like they got a consensus on this in 1977. But food manufacturers did not fully comply with this until 2001. So if you have a child that is on a formula for whatever reason, I would learn about this subject and look at those ingredients very carefully because there's a lot of stuff there. It wasn't until 1982 that omega-3s were finally recognized as essential for humans. However, at the time, it was widely believed that it was almost impossible to create a deficiency. 1985, scientists finally began linking an imbalance of omega-3s to omega-6s. Let's see here. 1987, a researcher discovered that fish oil could have a positive impact on insulin sensitivity and obesity. Let's see here. More stuff. 1995, 1999, evidence was shown that omega-3s had a positive impact on arrhythmia and sudden cardiac death, and 2 different researchers in 99, I should say, Hibben and Stoll, so guys doing like different research in different parts of the world, they both discovered that depression, mania, and bipolar disorder are all affected by omega-3 consumption, meaning like if omega-3 levels are low, those things are less likely to be a thing. So I know I mentioned in the description, I mentioned that I've been using omega-3s on and off, mostly on, since 1992. Back then I remember, even though there was some research coming out showing that there were some health benefits to omega-3s, it wasn't well understood, and like a lot of doctors were saying that like the common sort of narrative was that, you know, it might be okay to take a fish oil capsule like 1 to 3 times a week because it was a dietary fat. Dietary fat was supposed to be killing us. So, and then probably, I don't remember when it was published, But the Zone by Dr. Barry Sears came out, and that was one of the first times that a doctor said dietary fat isn't making people fat, which probably isn't like 100% true, but there's, for what he was talking about at the time, it had a lot of truth to it. So, and then since then, a lot more research has been done, and now a lot of doctors are recommending that people take some kind of fish oil, which is a good move. However, I would say you don't need to take you should take a pharmaceutical grade fish oil. You do not need to take a prescription fish oil. That's not necessary. You can find a good pharmaceutical grade fish oil over the counter. In the next video, I'll probably talk a little bit about what you should look at for those. But this has been long enough. It was longer than I wanted it already. So just a little bit of history for people that are interested. Why we ended up with omega-3 deficiency in the first place, which was basically came down to some bad science, in my opinion, as far as the cause of heart disease and manufacturers wanting more stable products. So if you buy whole food, you don't have to worry about that. So but that's a topic for another time. So thank you, and be safe, be productive, be healthy.